Thank you for being with us today. I know there are lots of places you could be and lots of other things that you could be doing, but you've chosen to be here, and we do appreciate that. And we think you're going to love the information that we've provided today. Several of you have been with us on calls previously and have requested to have both of these presenters back. They've both been with us before with IDI. It's been a bit of time. I think it was about late fall, I think, last year. And David was with us in January, I do believe, but so many questions that came in after that that we have asked him to be back, and he has graciously agreed to do that. Ryan Kuhlman is our president this year and is usually our MC. We will miss him today, but he has family weddings, and so preparing for that, definitely important stuff. Charles is with us today. He is our COO and our VP of Legislative Affairs. He's got a lot to talk about with some of the things that are happening across the U.S. Couple good, at least, but others very interesting. So just a quick disclaimer, although there are several things that we are talking about today that do have financial implications, we do ask that before you make your own financial decisions that you talk to a professional in your area that understands you and your circumstances. That applies to legal questions as well. So make sure that you have connected with a professional in your area that you can feel comfortable with and take their advice. We are here to promote, protect, and educate. We've been doing so for over 35 years now. We're a nonprofit association with affiliates all across the U.S. and chapters. We have great sponsors that have helped us with both this programming and others, and they provide benefits to members of our organization. Home Depot Pro is the largest of our benefit providers and this broadcast sponsor. They provide special programs for our members, which include discounts on paint, 20% off at the register, rebates, and other National REIA exclusive programs that apply to things like cabinets and paint. If you would like to learn more about connecting with the professionals that we talked about earlier in your area, or about the Home Depot program, or any other questions that you may have and educational opportunities locally, you can reach out to a local group and find them by coming to our website, which is at nationalreia.org. Then you can click here on Find a Local REIA. It will then give you a map of the U.S. You can type in by zip code or just simply zoom in on the map and find who you're looking for and those groups that are in your area. I am going to stop now and turn it over to Charles so he can give us a quick overview of what's happening in the investor world legislatively.
You had to say quick, didn't you? Man, crunch it down in time. All right, so couple of things going on, folks. Most people are aware that on Monday, the Biden administration came out with a, we're from the federal government, we're here to help solution for the housing shortfall. And there's two things to understand on this. One is a background of we're in election season. This is a Congress in total, meaning the House and the Senate are both pretty much at a deadlock right now. The House can pass things on a Democrat on a partisan basis. The Senate is reaching a point where they can't pass anything, and both sides are good with that, not being able to pass anything. So basically you're looking at a legislative logjam. So the Biden administration has a number of items in their requests, and I'm going to kind of skip over that part of it because it's an ask, and you're asking for legislative solutions in a time when legislation is not going to be solved. So there is a part, though, that's very important, and that is the regulatory aspect. Regulations are moving forward. It is being broadened. In Bill Track 50, we're actually expanding our regulatory tracking. This is the area where we think things are going to be most active, and this is where we can be most effective. There's a couple of things that were mostly manufactured housing kind of focused. One of the things is for chattel liens, or chattel mortgages, which is not really a mortgage, but it's a lien. Those are FHA is looking at picking those up. And what that would mean is local banks would no longer have to sit on those and hold them themselves. That FHA would have a federal backstop and be purchasing those. So that could be a very good thing for anybody that's into or has any kind of trailer parks, because that would be included. Again, we don't use the trailer park term. We use manufactured housing now. We have to clean everything up. It's all the politically correct terms, but this does affect trailer parks. And the fact is that is a low cost entry level housing that somebody can purchase. So it's good that the administration is recognizing that and not saying, oh, those are second class citizens, we shove them out and don't consider it. Along with that aspect of the manufactured housing and the chattel liens, there's also a broader consensus that FHA, which then means Freddie, Fannie, Jenny, need to consider and figure out how to start picking up some of the single family rentals that are being renovated. So yes, they're looking at both for rental property as well as home ownership, but this is one of those things where a lot of us have, as smaller owners, have purchased 4 or 5 single family homes, and the bank says, hey, that's all the more exposure we can take. You need to go find another bank to build a relationship with if you want to grow beyond that. Again, depends on the area. Some places it's 3, some places it's 9. Each bank is different. But if FHA steps in and says, hey, we'll start to purchase some of those portfolios, there's a financing there then that makes it much more available for our folks to do more business and be able to do it more consistently. It's kind of, it gets that federal, blessing on it. And that would be very helpful. That's also being looked at for simplexes as well as smaller apartment buildings. So that is a good benefit. Again, this is something this is literally a request that's come out from the White House on Monday and is going over to FHA and FHFA to do this research and to figure out how they can do it. That does not mean it will be done this summer. I expect there to be some conversations on it. We've reached out and talking to HUD now about how we could participate. So those are things I'll probably be reaching out, and you'll see some surveys probably coming out. I would probably say in about 2 months or so, with some feedback. Hey, what is this impacting you? Would this help? Would this not help? And some of that will be probably more numbers driven. So just an FYI on that piece of it. Across the board, as I mentioned, most things are regulatory focused, and at the federal level, things are really slowing down and for the most part have stopped. Literally, I was on the phone with some lobbyists this morning. The conversation was called mini lame duck. We're starting to see those across the board. You're going to see that not just at the federal level, but at state levels as well, as things kind of start to lock down. Having said that, there are efforts out there to move things forward. And please understand, they're not always to move things forward in the way that we're thinking of, but actually move people to vote. So there are some efforts out there by the Housing First groups, and they mean housing as a right. And those efforts are an effort to, whether it's rent control, source of income, eviction controls, and then parenthetically, we also see the kind of a green push on this with electric vehicle ordinances, meaning charging stations. So, but the main 3 with rent control, source of income, and eviction controls, we're seeing those in blue states at the state level. In red states, we're seeing those at the city level and municipal level. And part of the ballot side of this, just so we understand this, is yes, they want your conversation, they want input from folks, but this isn't necessarily about even the issue itself. It's about making sure that a certain constituency comes out to vote in that next election that they're preparing for. This is about preparing for grassroots, building grassroots, and growing from there. So please understand, your city might be in the crosshairs because it's not only that issue that's putting you in the crosshairs, but it's also behind the scenes trying to raise the votes and build the vote contact for the next presidential election. So that's part of what's going on. I just want to kind of give you that perspective. Rent control, we are seeing it across the board. As I said, in blue states, we're seeing it talked about at the state level, from tracking the Twitter comments of the elected officials, to red states where we're seeing a variety of municipalities. We're in Ohio, just had a meeting on one today, but we're seeing it coming out of Minnesota, Denver, specifically Colorado, but Denver, California, of course, up and down the West Coast, and starting to expand in the East Coast, going from kind of the Northeast area on down. So if you're in those areas, expect to see it, expect to hear it, but make sure you're plugging in with your elected officials to make sure that they know that you're involved in what you're doing, because some of this you may be able to be written out of it in terms of smaller properties. A lot of times they're willing not to have opponents. so that they will write some of us out of it. So know that going in. Having said that, once the camel's nose is under the tent, it's all bad news from there. So we're better off to get out there and let people know the real impact of housing and what it really costs and what really impacts us and why rents are going up. It's not just, hey, let's make some more money and raise rates. It's much more complicated than that. In fact, one of our partners with NAA and NMHC have shared that, and this is something we've shared out over the past, is only about 9 cents of every dollar can go towards any sort of profit. And that's if everything works out. So as we all know, that if can be a very big if and a very painful if at times. So just want to kind of give you a heads up along the lines on those issues. The other issue, and I'll mention this, is we've talked about fair housing before, fair housing issues, especially when it comes to equity. I would encourage the local associations, and if you're working with your associations, make sure you're showing up and participating in any fair housing updates. There's going to be a little bit of a shift in the language. HUD is focused on, and HUD is focused because the White House is focused on the term equity and what that means. And by equity, I don't mean the cost and value in a property that's built in there, equity in the sense of the social justice aspects of it. But you want to make sure that you are paying attention and up to speed on fair housing. HUD is updating their fair housing, and you want to make sure not only that you are up to speed with it, but up to speed with the proper language. I hate to sound Orwellian on that, but make sure you are doing it correctly. The cost for not doing so is very expensive. So let's just keep that in mind, and I encourage you to make sure you're participating and keeping up to speed on fair housing issues. With that, Rebecca, if there are questions, I can go from there.
Any questions for Charles before we move on? No, it's a lot to cover. Please remember, though, you're getting updates via email. Your groups are getting emails that hopefully they're forwarding on to you as members that have a recap for each month. And then his quarterly updates are in the Real Estate Journal that you also should be getting mailed to your home. If you're not, reach out, let us know, info@nationalreia.org, just to let us know if you're not getting that communication, and we can make sure that you are included on that. So we will now move on. David, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we keep tapping you for this, but 1031s right now, hot topic. I know I've got a couple people in my life, relatives, that they're looking at older properties that they have and know that they can do well in terms of, getting those out of their portfolio right now and getting into something else. So while times are hot, taking advantage. So if you could, I know you've done this a few times for us. Go ahead, let's start with what are 1031s? Why would you want to use them? And then also, I know we covered this a lot last time, but DST, they're becoming a hotter and hotter question for those people that are really worried about purchasing on their own, because, the cost of ownership of an individual property right now has risen so much. And then we'll take some questions if that's okay, sir.
Sure, absolutely. And I also want to make sure we leave about 30 seconds at the end, or maybe a minute, to talk about some legislative issues regarding 1031 exchange. So we'll save some time there for that. But 1031 exchange, for those of you who aren't familiar, is essentially playing Monopoly with real properties and real money, and structuring the transaction such that you don't have to pay capital gains tax when you sell Pennsylvania Avenue to buy Boardwalk. That's about as simple as it gets. We all know that if you make money on selling a property, there's going to be capital gains tax. And if it was an investment property, you were taking depreciation along the way. So Section 1031 allows you to leave those taxes in the pool when you go to reinvest your properties, in your next property. And it becomes a huge tool when you, for example, sell your first property for $100,000 and leverage up, and you buy the next one for 150 or 180, and then you sell that one for 300 and you buy the next one for 400 or 450. And if you keep leveraging up like that, Section 1031 can be a huge wealth building tool. Additionally, one of the things we see a lot is using Section 1031 as an estate planning tool. And people don't think about this, but I'll give you a real simple example. I worked with a gentleman a few years ago. I'll refer to him as Grandpa. Grandpa owned a small strip center not far from his home, and he was going to leave the strip center to 4 grandchildren. And his estate planning attorney suggested that was a great way to have the grandchildren fight after he left. So instead of leaving the strip center to the 4 grandchildren, Grandpa did a 1031 exchange. He sold the strip center. He exchanged up in value a little bit, and he bought 4 identical corner unit condominiums, a few minute walk from the main gate of a major university. And effectively what he had was student housing. And now when Grandpa passes, each of those grandchildren will inherit what will likely be a leased condominium near a major university, which they will likely never have difficulty renting, or they can sell it if they so choose, or they could move into it if they so choose, because the value to them is that they inherit the property at the fair market value as of the date of Grandpa's death. So all of that built-in gain and all of that depreciation recapture evaporates upon Grandpa's death. So there's a quick overview and a couple of the reasons why you might want to do a 1031 exchange. Do you want to go back and forth, Rebecca, or should I just keep on going?
Well, I'm going to let you keep on going to get
Okay.
train of thought until we get some questions, which I know we're going to have.
Absolutely.
But I'll just let you keep rolling if that's okay.
Sounds good. So a couple other quick reasons why you might want to do a 1031 exchange, and then I'll get into some of the logistics. Perhaps you're in one side of the state and you see growth is stronger at the other side of the state, or one county is stronger than another county, or municipal ordinances in one town are becoming onerous and you don't want your investments there anymore, so you want to move out of that town. Any reason that you would have to sell an investment property and you want to continue in the investment gain is an ideal time to consider a 1031 exchange. Additionally, as Rebecca was mentioning, Delaware statutory trusts are becoming very popular, especially with people who have been investing for years and perhaps now they're tired of being a full-time hands-on landlord, right? The terrible T's, the tenants, the trash, the taxes, all of that. So with a Delaware statutory trust, what happens is you sell your investment property, you work with the qualified intermediary to structure the exchange properly, and then you buy into a Delaware statutory trust, which looks an awful lot like a REIT, a real estate investment trust, except that it was formed very specifically using Delaware state law. And that doesn't mean that the investment is in Delaware. That just means that the paperwork and the corporate structure is centered in Delaware. So I'll give you an example of one that happened recently, and you'll be familiar with this little company called ESPN. ESPN has their corporate headquarters up in Connecticut. And for a variety of reasons, they sold their corporate headquarters and did a sale leaseback transaction, meaning they turned over the ownership, but they continued on as a tenant. Well, their owners now are some 50 or 60,000 investors who each own itty bitty little fractions of the ESPN headquarters in Connecticut. And there's an overriding sponsor who put the deal together, who negotiated with ESPN as to the sale price. And then once they got to the final numbers on the sale price, they went out and recruited investors. And the typical investment on a property like that is going to be probably about $50,000. So you could theoretically have sold a $100,000 row home someplace and bought $100,000 worth of ESPN's headquarters, or $50,000 of ESPN and $50,000 of a Amazon distribution facility, for example. So now you're no longer the active landlord. You get a dividend check deposited each month. At the end of the year, you get the appropriate tax papers to hand to your CPA, and life is good. And I think I saw a couple of questions.
And I think everybody else is as well. So just to clarify, you know, I started in the introduction talking about a lot of people may have, and this is the challenge that my relative has. It's an older rental home. It has been great for student rentals, but two challenges. One, legislation in the city is changing so that it's more difficult to rent there. Or to be a landlord there, and they just don't want the hassle. And two, the home is older and is going to need upkeep. That they just don't want to put the money back into it. And now that the market is where it is, they think they can do well. So would you suggest then, I'm going to use this as my own personal consulting session, would you suggest then that it is a good choice to 1031 out of that and into some other items, since they've owned it probably 40 years at this point?
So they sound like the ideal candidate for a 1031 exchange. Obviously, I can't give them tax or legal advice, and I certainly can't give them tax or legal advice through
But you have other clients that have been in similar circumstances.
100%. I have clients every day in very similar circumstances. They've owned the property 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And to keep it a competitive property, you really need to now go in there and upgrade the kitchen and the bathrooms and remove the paneling from 1984 and the linoleum from 1978 and all that stuff. So yes, I understand. And somebody on this call is going to say, oh my God, I want that property. That's a great place for me to come in there and do a fix and flip, right? Which, by the way, fix and flip doesn't count for 1031 exchange. You have to hold the property as an investment. So going in there and buying a property for $100,000 and putting $20,000 worth of improvements in it and then selling it for 170 isn't an investment in the IRS mind. That's a business. But for your family who's owned this property for 40 years or so and has actively rented it all that time, that's an investment. So yes, they can consider 1031 exchange into another asset that's more up to date, or into a Delaware statutory trust, or into a situation where maybe they own a piece, or they buy into a piece of a Best Buy or a Walgreens or something like that. There are myriad opportunities and options out there.
So one of the reasons I wanted to give the example, I kiddingly said it's for personal advice, but I'm going to bet many of you on this call are in that exact situation, and many of you, Jane, I'm looking at you with laws in Chicago, and many of others of you on this call are in other similar cities where it really, you've had rental property, it's really beginning to be challenging, and it may not be the newest of rental property, and 1031s may be a really good use for you. Those of you that on the call that are group leaders understand that you probably have members in this situation. Might be worth mentioning 1031s to them as a strategy, maybe having a session on that for them, because they may be in that kind of situation. Also, a couple questions already. Pamela says, is asking, can we 1031 into a piece of Amazon Hub or something like that? It sounds like a triple net lease. Is that true? And that's through the DSTs is how you do that. Can you just clarify for them a little bit there on that as well, David?
Sure, absolutely. This is not a triple net lease, although a triple net lease opportunity for a building where there is a triple net lease, like an Amazon or a Best Buy or a Walgreens or whatever, those absolutely are viable investment alternatives, investment options. You're not buying the lease, you're buying the property, or at least a piece of the property. A Delaware statutory trust is altogether different. A Delaware statutory trust, you're buying into the entity that owns, in the example I gave, ESPN's corporate headquarters, or perhaps a portfolio of mid-rise office buildings in the Dallas Metro, or whatever it might be. Or it could be an Amazon distribution facility, or a 3-story garden apartment complex in Southern Florida. There's literally every asset class is available in Delaware statutory trusts. The only thing I haven't yet seen, I haven't seen it, it may be out there, I haven't seen anybody providing or sponsoring properties that are green properties. For example, it's a wind farm or a solar farm, but it's only a matter of time before something like that becomes available as well.
And definitely as a transition of life strategy, 1031 is good. As you talked about, National REIA held a advanced investor, for lack of a better term, event several years ago, where we talked about how many of us, are at the point in time that we've had our investing journey and are ready to now start making some changes in strategies and in the way we're holding things and the way we're preparing to leave things. And so 1031, excellent idea for being able to maneuver through that without having tax penalties that you may, the unintended consequences of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And is there a way that they need to start preparing when that's, let's say maybe we're 10 years out, but I know I'm going to want to do the 1031. Anything they need to keep in mind as they start heading to that stage that will make it simpler for them when they get to the need for the 1031?
Well, 5 years out, 10 years out, probably not. But when you actually start seriously considering selling, which could be 6 months or a year out, in my humble opinion, it's not too early to reach out either to me or another qualified intermediary and say, this is what I'm thinking. Am I thinking in the right direction? So at least you don't do anything in that last year that turns your apple cart upside down. That's the last thing we want to see. Among the things you don't want to do in that last year, you don't want to change the ownership structure of the property. If right now, 10 years out, grandma and grandpa own the property in a family limited partnership or inside a joint LLC, they may want to speak to their tax attorney or their CPA. Should they leave it there? Should they change it? That kind of a thing. If it's owned by them individually, should they move it into a trust? Lots of things that they can start thinking about 5 and 10 years out. But once we get into that last 1 year window, let's not play with the way we hold title.
So prior to that, tax attorneys who you should be speaking with. As you get closer, in qualified intermediaries who you need to be speaking to.
100%.
Can you talk about the need to have one, because you do,
Yep.
the legal ramifications of that, and the kinds of services that a qualified intermediary would provide?
Sure. So let's first talk about the IRS definition of a qualified intermediary. And if you look in the regulations, it says that a qualified intermediary is a party to an exchange agreement, a contract with the taxpayer, and is not otherwise disqualified. So you're qualified if you're not disqualified. Who's disqualified is an important question. Your attorney, your CPA, your family members, your business partners cannot be your qualified intermediary. It must be a true disinterested party. And I like to think I'm a professionally disinterested party. Among the things that a qualified intermediary does is, of course, all of the paperwork that takes what would have been a plain vanilla sale and convert it into a 1031 exchange. So you're still going to have a real estate agent, and you're still going to have an attorney if you choose, and you'll still have a title company if you choose. But we would prepare the additional level of documentation, the exchange agreement, assignments, notices of assignment. Just as important, at the closing table, you can't receive the cash. So a qualified intermediary holds it for you. We hold all funds in segregated accounts. So there are 100+ people on this call. If we all owned a property together, I would open up 100 separate 1031 exchanges, 100 separate sub-accounts, and my finance team might be a little frustrated at the end of the day, but that's the way we would get it done. The other thing that a qualified intermediary does is that we provide some guidance. We can't provide advice because then that takes me from being the qualified intermediary to being your attorney, and I can't occupy both chairs at the same time. So we work in concert with your attorney and your CPA and your financial advisor. And often they come to us and say, I don't do 1031 exchanges all the time. Can you give me some more details? And we do. But ultimately, the structure and the decisions are between the client and their tax and legal advisors, not us. We don't actually provide the final, this is the way you should do it. We will share examples of what we have seen. Along the way, so from the date of closing, if we sell our old property today, we would have 45 days to identify a short list of potential replacement properties and 180 days from today to buy something from that list. You have no idea how fast 45 days and 180 days go. I was just looking earlier today, I was trying to make a point to somebody. Next week is 180 days since last Thanksgiving. Next Thursday will be 180 days since Thanksgiving. It just flew by. So it's prudent when you start thinking about selling, when you start thinking about a 1031 exchange, to also consider where you're going to go and start looking for that as well. Because there's also a structure where you can buy the new property before you sell the old property in what we call a reverse exchange.
In these days, with the market being so tight in terms of inventory, that 180 days is not like it was, 5 years ago. 5 years ago, that didn't sound as bad, but I will tell you, we've been looking, and it's interesting to try to find something that fits your need. And so, yeah, you may be using all of that 180 days.
The proportion of reverse exchanges as a total, as a fraction of our total, has doubled in the last 2 years. Meaning twice as many people as of the whole have been doing reverse exchanges. It's just crazy because they know that they can buy this, and if what they're selling is in even reasonable condition and it's marketed properly and it's selling at the right price, they'll have no problem selling it.
So talk just a minute about that reverse exchange. You mentioned what it is, but can you expand that just a little bit?
Sure. So in a reverse exchange, what would happen is, working with the taxpayer, we would form an LLC to take title to that new property on your behalf. Rebecca, I'm going to use you as the example. You would lend to me the money to buy that property on your behalf. So the money that you would have used to buy it, you now lend it to me and I buy it for you. All kinds of paperwork to protect you, so I'm not going to run off with your property. And now, from the date we buy that property, you will have 180 days to sell your old property. When you sell that old property, depending on a variety of things, the state you're in, the state the property's in, whether it's owned by you individually or with a spouse, are you in a community property state? When you sell that old property, we will either give you the LLC, which owns the property, or we will transfer to you by deed the property. So you will get the property that you bought. It's more cumbersome, there's more work, it's a little more costly, but it is a huge, huge strategy. And think about this for a moment. If the property that we're selling is rented, occupied, and cash flowing, and the one that I am buying is rented, occupied, and cash flowing, if I do a reverse exchange, I've doubled my cash flow for 180 days. So there are people who very intentionally structure their transactions as reverse exchanges for that reason.
Makes perfect sense. Question that's coming up is, what if I don't have the cash until I sell, and I need a bank loan or private money loan or bridge loan or something to get into that first property? How does that work when I'm now turning around and loaning you money? How do I have collateral for that loan?
So this comes up frequently. Many of our clients who do reverse exchanges have sufficient credit that they can go to the bank. And the banks these days understand reverse exchanges. They've been around long enough, since 2000, that most reputable banks understand a reverse exchange, and they understand that I'm only in title for a very short period of time. But for example, if you had to borrow money from your best friend Charles, he would lend it to you, you would lend it to me, it would be secure, it could be secured by the property. And then when you sell your old property, the money would flow through me back to you, back to Charles, to pay off the loan.
Pamela is asking which banks. Would you say that most major banks then would understand well enough to do a commercial loan on this, or are there a handful that are better than others?
That's a great question. I can tell you that the largest 3 or 4 or 5 banks, if you go and look up who the biggest banks are in the country right now, I don't want to use names. If you go look at if you were going into the largest 3 or 4 or 5 banks, unless you are uber wealthy, they're not going to want to get involved because they're just skittish. That's just who they are. If you go down to sort of that second tier of banks, so like banks number 5 through 30 or 40 or 50, which tend to be regional or super regional banks.
A relatively sizable regional bank would probably
Yes.
be a bet for this.
Yes, the regional banks and the super regionals tend to be what I'm seeing easy to go with. The local banks that have just a few branches, depends on the bank and it depends on where you are. I'm seeing some banks out in the Midwest and in the West where if they've known you and they know your family, they'll lend you anything you want, anytime you want. But if I go here, I'm in New Jersey, if I go here to a bank that has just 2 or 3 branches, they're going to think I have 6 heads.
It does make a difference. And that's why when hopefully at your REIA, you're learning that one of the first things you need to do as an investor is start building relationships.
Absolutely.
Relationship, even though that feels very old fashioned, still not out of style, especially if you're doing that with a semi-local or regional bank. When you get into some of these more advanced strategies and you need their help, it's good to know who to talk to there and to have that relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say build up your Rolodex, but more than half the people on this call don't even know what a Rolodex is.
I mean, most of us on this call do, but it's certainly not my kids. Would have no idea.
Yes.
Can we revisit, because a lot of people on this call are fix and flippers. They're rehabbers. And so they are in properties or working with properties that they're rehabbing. Can we revisit that timeline on how long the hold is? Because many of them will, rehab 3 and hold 1 of those as a rental, rehab another 4 and hold 1 back as a rental. So after they've rehabbed, what does that timeline look like in terms of their hold before they could participate in a 1031?
So again, the IRS, the statute says that the property was held for productive use in a trade or business or investment. So if I'm a landscaper and this is where I park my trucks and my skid steers and my lawnmowers and all that stuff, that's awesome. If I'm an investor and I have a single family or a multifamily or whatever and I rent it out, that's awesome. If I'm a rehabber and my business model is buy it, fix it, sell it, move on, that doesn't work, because in the IRS mind, that property that you bought was inventory. You bought it specifically with the intent to sell it. Inventory. And even though we all know that if I buy something for $100 and I put $20 worth of labor and materials into it and I can sell it for $150, that's a great investment. Except the IRS says, no, that was a great business. So what's the timeline? The IRS has never given us a black and white answer to that question. I don't suspect they ever will. And anytime somebody in Congress seeks to define some of those timelines, we jump in and dissuade them. from doing so. We don't like black and white answers on some of these gray areas. And I apologize if there's some noise coming through. There's some big thunder and some golf ball size hail falling outside my window right now. So I apologize for any background. Somebody who buys 3 or 4 properties, rehabs them all and holds one back. I think here's my lawyer answer. The longer you hold it, the better, right? Is 1 year long enough? Maybe, probably. 2 years long enough? Almost certainly. At the same time, though, I had a client very early in my career who bought a property as her replacement property in a properly structured 1031 exchange. And the day she went to closing to purchase it, she received a certified letter with an offer. And the offer was like 15% more than what she was paying for it. Well, guess what she did 60 days later? She sold it. Her intent when she bought it was to hold it and rent it out. Now, she never made any efforts towards renting it out because she had this offer that was 15% over what she just paid. So I think the final answer on this question is it's a fact-intensive question, and it would probably require a consultation with myself, with the client's attorney, and perhaps also their CPA. I did see a question come up about rehabbing expenses and such, and let me kind of answer a different question. Rehabbing expenses don't count as part of a 1031 exchange, again, if I'm just going to rehab it and sell it, because a rehab, a fix and flip doesn't count. But if I sell a property today for $400,000, Rebecca, and then I buy your family's property for $300,000, my exchange is kind of sideways. I didn't spend all of what I got from my sale. Properly structured, I can use that extra $100,000 to make those improvements to your family's home. I can update the kitchen, the bathrooms, get rid of the paneling and the linoleum, and make it a 2022 house instead of a 1982 house. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Would you say then that having history of having a hybrid model would be helpful when you're going into that exchange process, if you're going to try to hold for, I know I'm asking lawyerly questions.
Yeah, no. Actually,
your experience with other clients.
Look, there is no one investment strategy that fits everyone, right? I mean, I was at an event once. It was a real estate investment related event. One guy only invested in properties with government tenants. One guy wouldn't invest in properties with government tenants if you gave him the money to do it. Another guy only invested in Section 8 housing. I won't. That was his investment model. That's fine. But I also have a client who owns about a dozen properties. And every year he sells the oldest one in his portfolio, or one of the older ones in his portfolio, and he buys a new one. He's a school teacher. So come June 1st or June 15th or whatever, what does he spend his summer doing? Rehabbing the property, right? But then come September, it's ready for a new tenant. So he puts it on the market. So he spends, I mean, he rushes everything done to have it ready in time for the beginning of the school year because he's near elementary schools and all of those other things that make the properties he buys desirable for young families. So he's constantly selling the oldest one in his portfolio, or one of the older ones in his portfolio. So he's sort of refreshing his portfolio. And notice I'm very intentional not using the word inventory, right? So inventory is something that you buy to resell. Portfolio is something that you're buying to hold as an investment.
Very nice delineation.
I'm a lawyer.
It makes a really big difference.
It does.
Okay, next question. If I am the private lender for a reverse 1031 and the borrower cannot sell their house in 180 days, therefore the reverse mortgage falls through, what options do I have?
If you're the lender, wow. See, for the investor, if they structure a reverse exchange and they never get to sell their old property, they end up with 2 properties instead of 1. For the lender, Well, I guess at the end of the term of the note, either the investor is going to refinance the note or they're going to have to sell that property to pay you off. That's what's going to happen. If the investor got a short-term loan for that property, they'll have to do a refi at the end at whatever the prevailing rate is on day 178 or 179, whatever it might be. See, those people don't come to me for questions. The taxpayer who had the property they couldn't get rid of comes to me.
We have all ends of these transactions.
Yes, we do. And that's why I love this group.
What are some of the strangest situations that people have kind of gotten themselves into that you've had to face?
Well, see, we have 50 states plus 3 U.S. territories where you can do 1031 exchanges. And then so by that, I mean, you're not constrained to stay within your state. If you sell in Oklahoma, you can buy in Florida. If you sell in Massachusetts, you can buy in Texas. But you can also buy in the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Mariana Islands, and Guam, not Puerto Rico. Or if you own foreign property, you can buy anywhere else in the world except where I've just talked about. So I've had transactions where the client is selling property in Asia someplace and they want to move their investment property to Europe, which requires exchange rate fluctuation issues and different languages and different local rules regarding taxation. Some countries don't have a contract. When you sign the contract is the deed. So you and I can go back and forth for weeks negotiating, and when we finally sit down and sign the contract, we also turn over a check and keys. So there's those things. But then keeping it domestically, when you go out west and you talk about, and it's probably not just out west, it's probably in most of the states, you have a large property that maybe it's 100 acres of farmland and 2 acres of the people's primary residence, and they bought it as one big parcel, but the primary residence isn't part of a 1031 exchange, so somebody has to carve out the value of the house. Or we're selling an operating farm that also includes farm equipment. Well, the equipment itself, right, the John Deere tractor and the hay baler and those things, that's not real estate. But the silos that nobody's going to be able to pick up and move, that's been affixed to the real estate, that does count. So different property types create some issues. People who've owned the property for a long period of time and have never really been involved in a real estate transaction, who have no idea what they're doing. Kind of like putting a millennial in a standard shift car right now. It's, fun to look at, or give them a phone book and ask them to call Frank's Pizza.
Unfortunately, that's too true. So let's say we do have one of those challenges. I can definitely see where sometimes a primary residence would need to be detached from either an investment property that's sitting next door or a commercial facility sitting next door, or the farm is a great example. Are those things that you work with them if they don't have their own attorney to find an attorney? Something you give guidance on? How would that work for someone who has found themselves in one of those complicated situations?
With the farm example, which in our office comes up a lot, we have 4 offices around the country, including one in Montana and another one in Colorado. But I'm in New Jersey, and I've covered all of New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey and Delaware, plus most of the rest of the country. But you go out into central Pennsylvania, you go into some of the counties here in New Jersey, farms are every other property. Hopefully, when they bought the property, there was a CPA. And now we see, let's use Grandpa's 100-acre farm. Well, look at this. Grandpa has been saying that over the last however many years these people owned the property. I'm sorry, the CPA has been saying, however, over the years that Grandpa has owned the property, that 95 of those acres were the farm. And somewhere back in time, somebody applied to have the farm taxed differently than the residential portion of the property. So in New Jersey, as in many states, as long as you own a minimum size piece of property and it generates a minimum amount of cash in any 1 year, you can have that property taxed as farmland at a lower assessed value than as if it was your home. So if we've gotten some way to allocate property taxes over the years, it makes it easy. If that hasn't been done, so the last one I had was 70 some odd number of acres, but the house had a fence around it. So there was the main driveway and then a fence sort of separating the house from the rest of the farm. Well, I suggested that they get a local real estate broker to come in and value just the house. If I'm selling to Rebecca today, just my house, not the other 73 acres, what's the house worth? So as long as the taxpayer has something that they can hang their hat on as far as the allocations, we can make it work.
Awesome. Are there any restrictions other than the fact that it needs to be real estate of what I can 1031 into?
So no, any asset class, and you can go from any one asset class to any other asset class. You can mix and match those all day, every day.
Even if it's commercial. So can I go from a residential into a hotel or into, I think Airbnb is one of the
Yes.
examples.
Yes, all of it. I can sell, let's start small. I have 1 acre of unimproved land. I sell that in one very expensive community and I buy a single family home, 1031 exchange. I sell the single family rental, I buy a duplex, 1031 exchange. I sell that 1031 exchange into an apartment building, 1031 exchange into a shopping center, into an office building, into a golf course. If it's real estate, it's real estate.
And what if I'm near the end and I want to 1031 my rental into a personal residence?
So we don't talk loudly about that because we don't want the IRS to hear us talk about those things.
Okay.
But you 1031 exchange into a rental property. And after having rented it for a period of time, you move out of the house where you have been living. And so long as you were living in that house for at least 2 of the preceding 5 years, a married couple can shelter $500,000 in gain on that. And now you move into this last property and you just live there until you die.
Awesome. Okay. Next question. If the reverse 1031 falls through, the seller does not sell within 180 days, so that seller ends up with both properties, there is no tax deferment because it has fallen through. Is that correct?
There's no tax deferral because there was no taxable event. Buying a property doesn't generate income tax. Selling the property generates the capital gains tax. So when I now have 2 properties instead of 1, I mean, I paid the real estate professionals and everybody else in the transaction, but there's no tax penalty. That is correct.
Okay. If there were something that you wanted to make sure that we all knew and understood that we haven't covered so far, what do we need to remember about 1031s?
I'm going to give you 2 things.
Okay.
First, contact a qualified intermediary before closing. Once you've gone to closing, we can't fix it. It's never too early to contact a qualified intermediary. And whether you choose me or anybody else who's a member of the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, you'll be in good hands. Of course, I prefer you choose me, but so long as you hire somebody qualified, I'm okay with that. Contacting us when you get the contract is a great time to get started. That's number 1. Number 2, Section 1031 is in the crosshairs again. It seems to come up every couple of years. President Biden had 1 sentence about it during his campaign. He's raised it again as recently as a month or so ago as part of his, just last week, as part of his budget proposal. I'm going to ask you to go to, where'd it go? I lost the page. Oh, no, it is 1031buildsamerica.org. And you can go there and sign a petition that will go directly to your local state legislators. There is information there about the issues facing Section 1031. you'll see that there are about 6 industry groups who have signed on to this coalition to help protect this very, very valuable tool for you. There are folks in Washington who think that Section 1031 belongs only to people like Donald Trump and Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos. It doesn't. I can assure you that I have never done a 1031 exchange for any of them, or for Mark Cuban, or for any of those other people who you might think are too stinking rich. I have done 1031 exchanges for grandma and grandpa, and for Mr. and Mrs. Average America. And yes, I've done exchanges as small as $70,000 or $80,000 and as large as $80 or $90 million. But the majority of the exchanges are under $1 million, and Section 1031 is an important tool to help protect those people.
We certainly support those efforts. I want to let Charles talk to you about that, and about some opportunity zone questions and using 1031s, which could be an amazing paired together way to really build wealth and to deal with taxes. So I'm going to let him hop in there now.
Sure.
Thank you, Rebecca. And just so everybody knows, Lori has posted the link in there and in the chat. And I would encourage everyone, please go in, sign on to it. This is, again, we've supported this. We are supportive of it. Get information out there. And this is one of those things that 1031s periodically come up on the target list as this is for the rich folks. And the reality is, as David has said, it really is for everyday folks trying to build a little bit of wealth in this country. So encourage you to participate in that. You may have to put in a little bit of information, but that's just to make sure that it's, you know, you're who you say you are, those kind of things. So please do that. And with that, I'm going to kind of transition the conversation a little bit, David, if you don't mind. And one of the things we've had multiple conversations on over the years has been opportunity zones. They've been an interesting cross-section politically. And there are, you know, HUD has its website up. If you have any questions, you can go to the HUD website where it has the opportunity zone maps to find out if a property is in there. I literally was just working on one earlier this week, and it's outside of an opportunity zone. It was like, you know, so there are opportunities like that. But from a 1031 into an opportunity zone, do you find that to be a good thing, a bad thing? Do you find it? And how do you see those transitions and or working together? Put it that way.
Opportunity zones are sort of a cousin to 1031 exchanges. I've not seen a successful transaction use both at the same time to fully defer exchange. And that doesn't mean that they don't work, just means I haven't seen anybody do it. With an opportunity zone, you only reinvest the gain, right? You can pull out your equity and your initial investment, and you only reinvest your gain. In a 1031 exchange, you have to reinvest the whole sale price.
Right.
So, like I said, they're good cousins. The other thing with opportunity zones, you don't invest in a property, you invest in a fund that is running a property, which means you're giving up control unless you happen to have the wherewithal to start the fund. You're giving up your control, you're in the investment for a defined period of time, at the end of which you get back your money, and there's no new 1031 exchange opportunity at the other end. As I said earlier, there's no one investment strategy that is right for everybody. I have seen clients say, no, you know what, I'm not going to 1031 exchange, I'm going to do the QOZ, qualified opportunity zone. And I've seen others say, you know what, I've looked at the OZs and they're just not for me. Part of what bothers me personally is that opportunity zones, almost by definition, are properties that need to be rehabilitated on a grand scale. And
so, sometimes from scratch.
Yes, and sometimes in not so great neighborhoods.
Right. That's why it's in the opportunity zone. Yeah.
And that's why it's an opportunity. And sometimes I'll give you an example. There's one particular opportunity zone that I'm aware of in Wilmington, Delaware. When I found out that these few blocks were part of an opportunity zone, I laughed, because across the street was the headquarters of one bank. Diagonal across the street was the headquarters of an even larger bank.
Mhm.
On the other side was some apartment buildings, an apartment complex. But yes, these 3 blocks had fallen on hard times.
Right.
But they're 2 blocks from Rodney Square, right in the heart of downtown Wilmington, Delaware. If you're at all familiar, it's kind of almost prime property. There's good and there's bad in every investment, and you need to go in eyes wide open and do your due diligence.
Well, and I think that answers kind of the next question, which was, do we end up in a situation where somebody kind of overprices because they know that you might be in some sort of time frame or time crunch, and you know, again, it's due diligence at that point, correct?
Yeah, I have seen situations where if I know that you're coming up on your deadlines and you need to lock yourself in, might I want to take advantage of that? And lesser sophisticated investors can get burned that way.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, David, if you're still on. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks for the rest of the attendees for being here. Hopefully we got a lot of your questions answered that you have sent to us over time. Next month, we will actually be at mid-year. So we are going to have a presentation there that we will re-air for you. Charles will give your legislative update live. But talking about even more data tools that will help you really leverage your investing strategies and make sure that you are ahead of the market. Happy Friday. Again, have a great weekend. Thanks so much for being with us, and we will see you next month. Bye-bye.